Inez Salazar tightened her grip on the leash and walked toward the kennel at the far end of the garden. Behind her, the old housekeeper's voice dropped to almost nothing. No one has held on to him more than 10 seconds, 4 years now. Inez didn't turn around. She kept walking, gravel crunching under her shoes, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the hedges. The Calder estate stretched behind her like something out of a magazine, boxwood trimmed into perfect rectangles. None of it mattered right now. Only the door in front of her mattered, and the shape moving behind the chain link. She had been at Calder House 4 hours. Long enough to learn where the linen closet was, long enough to be told twice, once by the housekeeper and once by the family's attorney, a man who didn't bother introducing himself, to stay away from the kennel at the end of the garden. Stay away from where, exactly, nobody had said. She had asked anyway. The housekeeper, a woman named Carol, with silver hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, had glanced toward the garden's far edge and lowered her voice like she was confessing something. "That's Titan, Mrs. Calder's dog." Well, was Mrs. Calder's dog, was. Carol hadn't elaborated. She'd handed Inez a set of keys instead, told her which door not to leave unlocked, and walked off toward the kitchen like the subject was closed. But Inez had seen the way her hand trembled slightly when she said the name, the way hands do when they're hiding something, not when they're afraid. Now Inez stood at the fence, close enough to see him. He was bigger than she expected. A pit bull, brindle coat, scars along one ear that had healed wrong. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge at the chain link the way she'd braced herself for. He simply sat, haunches lowered onto the concrete, and looked at her, straight at her. Not at the leash in her hand, not at the gate latch, not at anything a dog usually fixates on when a stranger approaches. At her face. Carol's voice came from somewhere behind her, closer now, sharper. "Miss Salazar, I told you not to come out here. I was just looking," Inez said. Nobody looks at that dog for long, not without gloves, not without Mr. Doyle standing right there with a hose in case things go wrong. Inez didn't move. Titan hadn't growled, hadn't shown a single tooth, hadn't done anything the stories clearly wanted him to do. His ears were up, his body still, and something in the way he held himself was the stillness of something that had learned waiting, was the only thing it had left. 10 seconds, Carol said again, quieter this time, like the number itself scared her. That's the longest anyone's lasted with that leash in their hand. The vet, the trainer they brought in from the city, even Mr. Warwick himself. 10 seconds and then he goes rigid, and you'd swear he was about to tear the fence down. Inez crouched. Not because anyone told her to, because some old instinct, something from a childhood she didn't like to think about, told her that standing tall over an animal that size was the wrong kind of confidence to show him. Titan's ears shifted forward. Carol made a small sound, somewhere between a warning and a gasp, but didn't step closer. Inez held still, low to the ground, eyes level with his. He didn't flinch, didn't back into the shadows of the kennel the way frightened dogs did. He just kept watching her, head tilted a few degrees, the way a person looks at a face they can't quite place at a party. Whatever was supposed to happen in the next 10 seconds didn't happen. 15 seconds passed, then 20. Carol had gone silent behind her, and somewhere past the hedge a door opened and closed. Footsteps on the gravel path, someone coming to see what the new girl had done. Titan lay down, slowly, deliberately, like it cost him something. He rested his head on his paws, eyes still fixed on Inez, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Calder House, the enormous property around her went completely quiet. Inez didn't know his name yet when he did that. She only knew one thing, crouched there in the dirt with a leash she hadn't managed to clip on, and a dog who was supposed to be dangerous lying calm at her feet. Whatever this animal had been waiting 4 years for, he let out a slow breath and rested his head flat against the concrete, eyes finally closing. By the end of her first week, Inez had learned the rhythm of Calder House. by watching who moved where and when, and by staying quiet enough that people forgot she was listening. Breakfast at 7 for Mr. Warwick Calder, always alone, always at the same end of the long table facing the window. Roland Calder, his cousin, arrived closer to 8:30, usually already dressed for whatever meeting waited for him in the city, usually with a folder tucked under one arm like it never left his side. The kitchen ran on Carol's schedule, which ran on nobody's schedule but her own. And somewhere in all of it, twice a day, someone had to feed Titan. That someone had become Inez. Nobody had assigned it to her exactly. Carol had simply stopped doing it after the third day, claiming her knees, and Mr. Doyle, the gardener, had a bad hip that made the walk to the far kennel a 15-minute ordeal each way. Inez had offered before anyone asked her to. She told herself it was because nobody else wanted the job. She didn't examine the offer any closer than that. The mornings went the same way. She'd bring the bull, set it inside the gate, and Titan would wait until she stepped back before he ate, watching her the entire time, the way a man watches a door he doesn't trust to stay shut. He never growled, never showed teeth. The stories Carol told, of a dog that had reduced a professional trainer to climbing over a fence, felt less real every day. Inez spent standing 3 feet from him with nothing between them but an old chain-link gate. She started bringing scraps from her own plate, a corner of toast, a strip of bacon fat, small things that didn't cost the kitchen anything. He took them from her fingers gently. A trainer's report she'd found in the kennel shed described him as unpredictable, not recommended for rehabilitation. Neither reading matched the animal waiting patiently for a piece of toast. It was the 10 o'clock walk that told her the truth. Mr. Doyle had explained it to her without being asked, in the clipped way he explained most things. Dog needs exercise, same time every day. Same path, out past the rose garden, down along the hedge line, back through the east lawn. Don't change the route. She hadn't thought to ask why the route mattered until the 4th morning, when she clipped the leash to Titan's collar, and for the first 6 minutes of the walk he trotted beside her easily, nose down, tail loose, a completely different animal from the one who'd been described to her in whispers. Then they reached the stone steps by the rose beds. Titan stopped. His pace broke all at once, all 4 legs locked, body gone rigid, and a low sound came out of him that Inez had never heard from a dog before, caught somewhere between a whine and a growl. She pulled gently on the leash. He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the 3rd step down, the one closest to the overgrown climbing roses, and his whole body had begun to shake. "Titan," she said low, "hey, it's okay." It took almost a full minute before he'd move again, and when he did, he didn't walk down those steps. He went around them, cutting through the grass in a wide arc, refusing to put a single paw on the stone, and once they were past it, he was calm again. Tail up, nose down, like nothing had happened at all. Inez didn't sleep well that night. She kept turning it over, the way his whole body had gone rigid at one exact spot in an otherwise ordinary garden, the way none of it matched anything a dog would fear on instinct. Something had happened there, and his body remembered it better than his mind ever could. She tried the walk again the next morning, and the next, timing herself on the cheap plastic watch she'd bought at the drugstore, watching the second Titan's ears flattened against his skull. Every single time, it happened at the same step. Every single time, he refused to cross it directly, and every single time, once they'd passed it, he walked the rest of the way home, as though the previous 90 seconds hadn't happened at all. That inconsistency bothered her more than the fear itself. A dog afraid of the whole garden she could understand. A dog afraid of exactly one stretch of stone, and calm everywhere else, meant something had happened there, only there. On the 5th morning, after the shaking had passed, Titan slowed his pace to match hers exactly, and then, without any signal she gave him, pressed the side of his head against her leg and left it there while they walked, not pulling away when she rested her hand on his neck. Nobody had told her a dog could do that, lean in and just stay, asking for nothing out loud. She was still turning that over 3 days later when she rounded the hedge near the rose garden and found a man standing there watching her, hands folded in front of him, dressed too well for a Tuesday morning at home. "You must be the new girl," he said. "Roland, I don't believe we've met." "Inez," she said, and reached down out of habit to steady Titan, who had gone very still beside her, ears back, gaze fixed on the man in front of them. Roland's eyes moved from her face to the dog, then past them both, toward the stone steps by the roses, and lingered there a second too long before he smiled and asked how she was finding the house so far. "Fine, sir," she said. "Everyone's been kind." He asked a few more questions, easy ones, where she was from, how long she'd been in the trade. His tone stayed pleasant, and yet the way he kept glancing at the leash in her hand, at Titan's ears, at the distance between the dog and the rose bed behind them, made the pleasantness feel like a performance running slightly out of sync with what he was actually paying attention to. He never once glanced at Titan again for the rest of the conversation. Inez noticed that too, filing it away without deciding yet what it meant. Mr. Doyle had worked the grounds at Calder House for 31 years. Inez knew this because Carol had mentioned it once, in passing, the same way she mentioned that the silver needed polishing, or that Mr. Warwick preferred his coffee black. A fact, filed away, not worth dwelling on. Inez started dwelling on it anyway. She found him most mornings in the greenhouse behind the east lawn, a low glass building that smelled of wet soil and cut stems, his hands moving over the pots with a slowness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with care. He didn't talk much. The first 3 times she tried to start a conversation, he answered in single words, or didn't answer at all, just kept pruning whatever was in front of him. She learned to work around his silence instead of through it. She'd bring him a cup of coffee, set it on the potting bench, and busy herself sweeping loose soil off the concrete floor while he drank it. Eventually, without her ever asking a direct question, he started talking, not about the family, never about the family, about the roses, mostly. How Mrs. Calder had planted the bed by the stone steps herself, 20 years back, on her hands and knees, in a sun hat that made her look, Doyle said once, like she belonged in a painting rather than a garden. He talked about the soil out there, heavy clay that needed working every spring, about the particular yellow rose she'd loved above all the others, one she'd named for no reason anyone remembered except that she liked the sound of the word. He never talked about how she died. He circled the subject the way water circles a drain, never quite falling in. Inez waited for the right moment. It came on a gray Thursday, rain threatening, when Doyle was repotting a fern and she was refilling the watering cans. "What happened to her?" Inez asked. "Mrs. Calder." Doyle's hands stopped moving, just for a second. Then they started again, steady as before, like the pause had never happened. "Accident," he said. "Out in the garden." "Which part of the garden?" He didn't answer that one. He picked up his trowel and moved to the next pot. And Inez understood. The way you understand a door has been closed even when nobody slammed it, that the conversation had ended. She didn't push. She'd learned that lesson once already, in a different house, with a different old man who didn't want to talk about things that weren't hers to ask about, and it had cost her a job she'd needed badly. She let it go for the day, though she noticed, walking back to the main house, that her hands had gone cold in a way the weather alone didn't explain. But that night, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters, she pulled out a small notebook she'd bought at the drugstore in town on her first day off, the kind with a spiral binding and a plain cardboard cover, and she wrote down the date, and beneath it, 3rd step, Rose Garden. Titan freezes every time. Doyle won't say what happened there. She kept writing after that. Every reaction, every place, every time. The steps, always the steps. Never the greenhouse, never the fountain, never the long gravel drive where deliveries came and went all day. Only that one spot, a stretch of stone no more than 3 feet wide, tucked into a corner of the garden that most people probably walked past without a second glance. She started timing the walks differently, taking Titan the long way sometimes, the short way others, watching to see if his reaction changed with the route or stayed fixed to the location itself. It stayed fixed. Didn't matter if they approached from the east lawn or straight down the gravel path. The moment he came within about 10 feet of that third step, his whole body locked up the same way, every time, down to the same low sound in his throat and the same tremor running through his shoulders. Some nights she lay in bed doing the arithmetic of it. 4 years since Mrs. Calder died. 4 years of a dog that had once, according to Carol, slept at the foot of the old woman's bed every single night, being fed twice a day by strangers, and walked on a schedule nobody explained to him. 4 years of the same reaction to the same 3 feet of stone, and not one person in that enormous house curious enough or brave enough to ask why. She thought about her own mother sometimes, doing that arithmetic, though she couldn't have said exactly why the two things connected in her mind. Her mother had died slowly, over months, in a room nobody wanted to sit in for very long, and Inez remembered how the whole family had found small, polite ways to stop talking about it before it was even finished happening. Calder House felt the same way to her now. A house full of people who had agreed, without ever saying so out loud, that certain rooms and certain patches of stone simply didn't exist anymore. 4 days into her notebook, she was crouched by the rose bed, jotting down the time, 7:18 in the morning, second occurrence today, when she felt someone behind her and turned to find Mr. Doyle standing there, watching her write. She closed the notebook fast, heat rising up her neck. Doyle didn't say anything about it. Not right away. He crouched down slowly, joints cracking, and picked up a stray weed growing between 2 paving stones, examining it like it was the most interesting thing he'd seen all week. "Careful what you're looking for," he said finally, still not meeting her eyes. Inez's mouth went dry. "I'm not looking for anything. I'm just trying to understand the dog." Doyle straightened up, slow, one hand braced on his lower back. He looked at her for a long moment, longer than he'd looked at anyone since she'd arrived, his eyes pale blue and tired. And underneath the tired, his hands had gone still on the trowel in a way that had nothing to do with the weed he was holding. "That dog understands plenty," he said. "More than most people in this house give him credit for." He didn't explain what he meant by that. He walked back toward the greenhouse, his limp more pronounced than usual, and left her alone by the rose bed, with her notebook still warm in her hand from where she'd gripped it. She almost didn't notice the shears until she stood to leave. They were old, the wooden handles worn smooth from decades of use, set down deliberately on the low stone wall beside where she'd been kneeling, right at the spot she always crouched to watch Titan's reaction. Not left behind by accident. Doyle never left tools lying around. She'd watched him clean and put away every implement he touched, obsessively, like it mattered more to him than almost anything else in the garden. She picked the shears up, turned them over once in her hands, and understood without being told that he'd left them there on purpose. A reason to be seen kneeling in that spot for as long as she wanted, tending to roses that didn't need tending, if anyone asked what she was doing there. He hadn't told her anything, but he'd given her permission to keep looking. That night, she added one more line to the notebook, beneath the growing column of dates and times. "Doyle knows something, won't say it, left me a way to stay." She underlined it twice, then closed the notebook and slid it under her mattress, the way she used to hide things from her mother when she was 12 years old and had learned, the hard way, that some questions were only safe to ask in the dark. Roland Calder found her on a Tuesday, and later Inez would think that was the strange part. how ordinary the morning had felt right up until it wasn't. She'd taken Titan for the 10 o'clock walk, same route as always, and afterward, instead of heading straight back to the kennel, she'd stopped by the rose bed to write down the time of his reaction while it was still fresh. 7:12, she'd written. Full body rigid, 11 seconds before release. She was underlining the number when a shadow fell across the page. Interesting reading material. She hadn't heard him approach. Roland stood over her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face, and his expression had none of the polished warmth from their first conversation weeks earlier. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone flat and cold, fixed on the notebook in her hands like it was something dangerous. "Mr. Calder," she started, closing the notebook on instinct. "Give that to me. It's just notes," she said, "about the dog's schedule, feeding times." Roland held out his hand, palm up, and didn't move it, didn't blink, didn't do anything but stand there with his hand extended until the silence became its own kind of pressure. A gardener's cart clattered somewhere near the greenhouse, and neither of them looked away from the other long enough to notice. "Give it to me, Inez." She'd never heard him use her first name before. It landed wrong, too familiar and too cold at the same time, flat and formal, the kind of tone people use right before they take something from you. She thought about refusing. Thought about walking away with the notebook still in her hand, back straight, the way she used to walk away from arguments she knew she couldn't win, but refused to lose completely. For one long second, she actually weighed it, whether her legs would carry her past him toward the house before he could stop her, whether 5 weeks of careful observation were worth the risk of finding out. Then she thought of the letter of reference that had never arrived from her last position, of how quickly a life could collapse when someone in power decided it should, and the calculation resolved itself before she'd fully finished making it. She handed it over. Roland flipped through the pages fast, his eyes moving down each one, and Inez watched his face change as he read, the muscles along his jaw tightening with every page he turned. He stopped somewhere in the middle, on an entry she remembered writing 3 days earlier, and his hand went still. "What is this?" he said. His voice had dropped, quiet now, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "What exactly are you doing out here every morning?" I was just curious why he reacts that way. It seemed important to keep track. Curious. He said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. Then, without any warning, he tore the page out. One clean motion, the paper ripping free from the spiral binding, with a sound that felt louder than it should have in the quiet garden, and he crumpled it in his fist. "You're a maid," he said, "not a detective. Not a veterinarian, not family. You clean rooms, and you feed a dog because nobody else wanted the job, and that is the extent of your business in this house. Do you understand me?" Inez didn't answer right away. She was watching his hand, the one still crushing the torn page, and she noticed for the first time a scratch running across the back of it, days old, not quite healed, the kind of mark a person keeps their sleeve pulled down over. He noticed her looking. Roland straightened, pulling his sleeve down over his wrist in a motion so quick it looked almost automatic, and when he spoke again his voice had smoothed back into something closer to the man she'd met that first week, the polished cousin with the folder always under his arm. "Cat," he said. "Feral one out by the stables, nasty thing, scratched me trying to move it off the porch." Inez said nothing. There were no cats at Calder House. She'd been there 5 weeks and had never seen or heard one, and Mr. Doyle, who noticed everything about the grounds down to which rosebush needed staking, had never once mentioned strays near the stables. She thought of the mousetraps in the pantry, set for mice and nothing larger, and of how a house that size would have known instantly if a feral cat had taken up residence anywhere close to the horses. She almost said as much. She almost asked him which stable, which porch, whether anyone else had seen this cat he described so easily. But something in the flat certainty of his voice told her that questioning the story further would only cost her more than the notebook already had, so she swallowed the question and let it sit, sour, at the back of her throat. But she filed that away the same way she filed everything else now, quietly, without comment, keeping her face still and her breath even, giving him nothing to read. "If I see you out here again with a notebook," he said, "or hear that you've been asking Doyle questions he has no business answering, you'll be packing your bags by that afternoon. No reference, no second chance. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He handed the notebook back to her, minus the torn page, and walked off toward the house without another word, his stride even and unhurried, the way a man walks when he believes he's already won. Inez stood alone by the rose bed for a long moment after he'd gone. Her hands weren't shaking, not exactly, but there was a tightness behind her ribs that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier, and when she finally looked down at the notebook, she saw that the missing page had been the one listing every date and time Titan had reacted to the steps. Weeks of observation, gone in one motion. She thought about her last job, the family in the city who'd let her go inside a week of her raising a concern that wasn't hers to raise, how the letter of reference they'd promised had never arrived, how 3 months of unemployment had followed, 3 months of counting coins for the bus and sending less money home to her sister than she'd meant to. She thought about how easily the same thing could happen here, how quickly a life could tip from steady to nothing over a question someone in power didn't want asked. She thought too, standing there with the wind picking up over the rose beds, of how differently Roland had looked at her the very first week, all easy questions and pleasant smiles, and how thin that pleasantness had turned out to be the moment she'd found something he didn't want found. She thought about Titan lying calm at her feet that first afternoon, the way he'd pressed his head against her leg on the walk back from the rose garden, the way something in him had recognized something in her that nobody had bothered to look for in either of them. She went back to her room that afternoon and, with hands that trembled only a little, tore the remaining pages out of the notebook, folded them small, and hid them inside the lining of an old winter coat she hadn't worn since arriving. Not thrown away, just out of sight. Buried deep enough that no one would think to look, close enough that she could reach it again if she needed to. She sat on the edge of her bed afterward for a long while, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house settling around her, a door somewhere, water running in a pipe behind the wall, and tried to decide whether what she'd just done felt like giving up or simply like waiting for a better moment. She wasn't sure there was a difference, not yet. She told herself it was over, that she'd let it go, the way she should have let it go weeks ago, before any of this had become more important than keeping a job she badly needed. She said the words out loud to the empty room, quietly, as though saying them might make them true. That night, past midnight, she woke to a soft scratching sound at her door. She lay still at first, heart pounding, certain it was nothing, the old house settling, a branch against a window somewhere. But the sound came again, low and rhythmic, unmistakably a paw against wood, and when she finally got up and opened the door a crack, Titan was sitting in the hallway outside her room. He wasn't supposed to be loose in the house. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the staff quarters, and she had no idea how he'd gotten free of the kennel, or how he'd found his way to her door specifically, out of every door in that enormous house, unless someone had left the latch undone, or unless 4 years of studying every gap in a fence had taught him more than anyone gave him credit for. He didn't come inside when she opened it wider. He simply lay down across the threshold, nose resting on his paws, and stayed there through the night, a warm and silent weight against the wood, as if he already knew something had gone wrong for her that day, and had decided, in whatever language dogs understood loss and fear, that she shouldn't be alone with it. For 6 days, Inez did exactly what she'd told herself she would do. She fed Titan at the usual times, walked him along the usual route, and when they came near the rose bed, she kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, refusing to slow down even when his whole body locked up beside her the way it always did. She didn't write anything down. She didn't linger. She'd learned her lesson, or told herself she had, and some mornings she almost believed it. Carol noticed the change first. "You've gone quiet," she said one afternoon, watching Inez fold towels with more precision than the task required. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Inez said, and Carol let it drop, the way people in that house let most things drop, because asking further questions in a place like Calder House rarely led anywhere good. Inez had noticed by then that Carol's silence wasn't ignorance. It was survival. 30 years of learning exactly how much curiosity a household like this one could tolerate before it turned dangerous. Some evenings, folding sheets side by side in the laundry room, Carol would start a sentence about the old days, about Mrs. Calder's garden parties, or the way the whole staff used to gather in the kitchen on Sunday afternoons, and then stop herself halfway through, as if she'd walked right up to the edge of something and remembered, at the last second, not to look down. Inez learned to recognize the pattern without commenting on it. It was, she thought, its own kind of grief, one that had never been allowed to finish. Roland kept his distance too, which felt less like relief and more like being watched from somewhere she couldn't see. She caught him once, from the second-floor landing, standing at the edge of the garden looking out toward the rosebed with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between satisfaction and unease, like a man checking that a door he'd locked was still locked. "Mr." Doyle grew quieter as the week went on, not unfriendly, just distant, the way a person gets when they're carrying something they've decided not to put down on anyone else. Inez still brought him coffee in the mornings, still swept the greenhouse floor while he worked, but the conversations had thinned to almost nothing, a nod here, a comment about the weather there. On the 7th morning, she found him waiting for her outside the greenhouse instead of inside it, which had never happened before. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder, worn soft at the edges, the same bag he carried his gardening notes in, and something in the way he stood, feet planted, hands folded in front of him, told her before he spoke that this wasn't going to be an ordinary morning. "I'm being sent to the coast property for a while," he said. "Warwick wants the hedges out there redone before autumn, leaving this afternoon." Inez felt something drop in her chest, quick and sharp. "How long?" Doyle shrugged, a small tired motion. "Didn't say. These things have a way of not ending when they're supposed to." She wanted to ask him if he thought it was a coincidence, being sent away less than a week after Roland had torn a page from her notebook, but she already knew the answer from the look on his face, and asking it out loud felt like it would only make the danger more real for both of them. Doyle glanced back toward the house once, quick, like he was checking whether anyone stood at a window watching them talk. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, worn book, its leather cover cracked along the spine, pages yellowed at the edges. "Been keeping this since I started here," he said, holding it out to her. "Grounds maintenance. What got planted, what got moved, what got dug up and replanted somewhere else. Boring stuff, mostly." Inez took it, the leather warm from being carried against his body. "Why give it to me?" Doyle didn't answer that directly. He looked past her, toward the rose garden, toward the third step she knew he was thinking about, even though neither of them said the word. "That dog," he said, "has never once done anything to deserve what this family's done to him. 4 years locked up for something he never did." The words landed heavier than anything he'd said to her in 5 weeks combined. Inez opened her mouth to ask what exactly Titan hadn't done, what exactly had happened at those steps, but Doyle was already stepping back, adjusting the satchel over his shoulder, his face closing the way it always closed just before he stopped answering. "I was here," he added, so quietly she almost missed it, that morning. "I saw more than they think I did." Inez went still, certain he was finally about to say the one thing that would explain everything, but he only shook his head, as if the rest of it had already cost him more than he could afford to spend on a Tuesday morning outside a greenhouse. "Take care of him while I'm gone," he said. "Nobody else here will." And then he was walking away, down the gravel path toward the front of the house where a car was already waiting, and Inez stood alone with the leather notebook in her hands, watching him go, wondering if she'd ever see him again, or if this was the last piece of the truth she was going to get. She went about the rest of her day the way she always did: laundry, linens, the endless small tasks that filled an estate that size, but the notebook sat in the pocket of her apron the whole time, a weight she felt every time she reached for a folded sheet or a stack of towels. Twice she caught herself standing still in the middle of a hallway, staring at nothing, until a door closing somewhere reminded her to move. By the time she passed the kennel that evening with the dinner scraps, she found herself talking to Titan the way she hadn't let herself do before, quietly, under her breath, telling him that Doyle was gone, but that she wasn't, that whatever the old man had almost said outside the greenhouse, she intended to find the rest of it herself. Titan watched her the whole time, ears forward, tracking her voice the way he tracked every sound in that garden now, as if it mattered. She didn't open the notebook until that night, sitting on the edge of her bed, with the lamp turned low so the light wouldn't show under her door. The pages were dense with Doyle's careful, cramped handwriting, dated entries stretching back years, most of it exactly what he'd promised: rose varieties, pruning schedules, notes about frost damage and irrigation timing. Ordinary. Almost soothing in how ordinary it was, page after page of a man's quiet devotion to a garden that had outlasted the woman who'd planted half of it. She flipped through slowly, hour bleeding into hour, reading entries about aphids and mulch and a hard frost that had killed half the hydrangeas one April, and somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary devotion, she found herself grateful for it, for a man who had spent 31 years writing down small, patient truths about a garden nobody else bothered to notice, until she reached a spot near the back where the pattern broke. A page had been torn out, not cleanly, the way a page comes free when someone means to remove it. Torn close to the spine, ragged, like it had been ripped in a hurry, leaving only a thin strip of paper still attached to the binding. She held it up to the lamp, tilting it, and could just make out the faint indentation of handwriting pressed through from the missing page, a ghost of words she couldn't read. What she could see, pressed faintly into the strip that remained, was a date. She couldn't make out the month clearly in the lamplight, the ink too faded, the fragment too small, but the day and the last 2 digits of the year were legible enough. She stared at them for a long time, turning the notebook one way and then another, trying to force more meaning out of a torn scrap of paper than it was willing to give her, tilting it toward the lamp, then away from it, then holding it flat against the mattress and pressing her thumb along the indentation as though touch alone could tell her what her eyes couldn't. She didn't know yet what that date meant. She only knew, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone, that someone had gone to the trouble of removing exactly 1 page from an old man's gardening notes, and that whatever had been written there mattered enough to someone that they hadn't wanted it read. A page about hedges and frost damage didn't get torn out in a hurry, only a page that had strayed, even once, from hedges and frost damage into something a person walking through that garden had actually seen. She closed the notebook, held it against her chest for a moment the way you'd hold something fragile, and then hid it beneath the same loose floorboard where she'd already tucked away the folded pages from her own notebook weeks earlier. Somewhere down the hall, faint through the old walls of the house, she heard the low, restless sound of Titan pacing in his kennel, back and forth, as though he too understood that something had just been taken away from both of them, and that the coast property was farther than Doyle's absence alone could explain. Warwick Calder kept his study on the ground floor, at the end of a hallway Inez rarely had reason to walk down after dark. She was there that night only because Carol had asked her to bring up a tray of tea before bed, one of the small, unremarkable errands that filled most of her evenings, and she was halfway down the hall when she heard voices behind the study door, low, urgent, one of them Roland's. She should have kept walking. She told herself that later, lying awake, replaying it. But something in the tone stopped her. A sharpness that didn't match the easy warmth Roland usually performed in front of the rest of the household, and she found herself standing just outside the door with the tray balanced in her hands, unable to make herself knock. "He's gotten worse," Roland was saying. "You know he has. Ask anyone on staff. Ask Carol. He nearly took a hand off the delivery man last week." "That's not what Carol told me," Warwick's voice answered, tired, thin, the voice of a man who'd had this argument before and lost it every time. "Because she's afraid of him too, and won't say it to your face." "Warwick, I'm not asking you to do this because I enjoy it. I'm asking because I've watched that animal get worse for 4 years, and I don't want to be the one who has to explain to someone why we waited too long." Silence. Long enough that Inez almost convinced herself the conversation had ended. Then she heard the scrape of a chair, the soft rustle of paper, and beneath it, so quiet she almost missed it, the sound of a man exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for longer than made sense. "I had a facility draw this up last week," Roland said. "All it needs is your signature. Quiet. Far from here, nobody has to know he's gone until it's already done." Another silence. Inez pressed herself flatter against the wall beside the door, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, tea rattling against porcelain, and she thought, absurdly, that if either man opened that door right now she would have no explanation at all for why she hadn't knocked 5 minutes earlier. Her mind ran ahead of her anyway, cataloging exits, the back stairs, the linen closet at the end of the hall, the way people do when they've spent enough of their life learning not to be caught somewhere they weren't supposed to be. "He was her dog," Warwick said finally, so quiet Inez had to strain to catch it, "the last thing she loved before she went." "I know," Roland said. "I know that, which is exactly why keeping him here isn't a kindness to her memory. It's cruelty, dragging this out. You've been punishing yourself for 4 years over an accident, Warwick. Let him go." Warwick didn't answer right away. Inez could hear him moving, slow footsteps crossing the study, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard from the window that she'd learned during her first week cleaning that room, and she pictured him standing there with his back to his cousin, looking out at a garden he hadn't walked through willingly since the funeral. "I keep thinking about that morning," Warwick said, so low Inez had to hold her own breath to catch it. "The morning we lost her. I wasn't even there, and some nights it still finds me anyway." "You don't have to carry that anymore," Roland said, and something in his voice had softened into a kind of gentleness that Inez, standing in the hallway with a cold tray in her hands, understood now was its own kind of performance, rehearsed and precise. "Sign it. Let both of you finally rest." There was a sound then that Inez recognized without seeing it, the particular scratch of a pen moving fast across paper, signing something a person had already decided. Somewhere deep down, they didn't have the strength to keep fighting. "Done," Roland said, and his voice had changed. His voice had gone faster, lighter, the sound of a man setting something down he'd been carrying too long. "First thing in the morning, I'll handle everything myself. You won't have to see any of it." Inez didn't remember walking away from the door. She remembered standing in the dark kitchen sometime later, with the tea gone cold on the tray, her hands finally steady only because she'd set the tray down, staring at nothing, running the conversation back and forth in her mind, trying to find some detail that would change what she'd heard. There wasn't one. Warwick had signed. First thing in the morning meant hours, not days. Whatever Titan had spent 4 years surviving, trapped in a body that flinched at one particular stretch of stone in an otherwise ordinary garden, was going to be taken away for good before the sun came up twice more. She thought about waking Carol, telling her everything, the notebook, the torn page, the scratch on Roland's wrist that didn't match any cat in that house. But Carol had made her own peace with silence years ago, and Inez had no proof that would survive being said out loud to someone whose job depended on not asking questions. She thought about calling her sister just to hear a voice that had nothing to do with any of this, and decided against it. There wasn't a version of that conversation that wouldn't end with her sister telling her, gently, to let it go and keep the job. She went outside without deciding to. The night was cold enough that her breath showed in front of her, the estate silent except for the distant hum of the fountain pump and, somewhere past the hedges, the occasional restless sound of Titan shifting in his kennel. Above the hedges, the sky had cleared just enough to show a scatter of stars, indifferent and very far away, and Inez found herself wondering, absurdly, whether Margaret Calder had ever stood in this same spot on a night like this one, before any of it happened, before a staircase and a signature and a torn page had turned her garden into something that needed to be walked around instead of through. She sat down on the gravel outside the fence, close enough to feel the cold seep through her clothes, and didn't say anything at first. There wasn't anything to say that either of them would understand in the way it needed to be understood. She reached her hand through the chain link instead, palm open, fingers resting against the cold metal. Titan came to the fence slowly, the way he always moved when nobody was rushing him, and pressed his nose against her open palm, warm breath against her cold skin, staying there without pulling away, without needing anything more from her than the fact that she'd come. Inez sat like that for a long time, the cold working its way up through the gravel into her bones, one hand pressed against a fence that was going to mean nothing by tomorrow evening if she didn't find a way to stop what had just been signed inside that study. Overhead, clouds moved slowly across a moon that gave almost no light at all, and somewhere in the dark house behind her, a man who loved this dog more than he'd let himself admit in 4 years, was already asleep, believing he'd finally done the merciful thing. She thought about the crack she still hadn't found, the one she was certain lived somewhere in that garden if she looked hard enough, some physical trace of the morning Margaret Calder died, that 4 years of silence hadn't managed to erase completely. She thought about Doyle's torn page, its faded date pressed into paper like a held breath. She thought about how little time was left to turn any of it into something a man like Warwick would believe over his own cousin's word. She didn't have a plan yet. She only had a torn page's worth of a date she couldn't fully read, a set of gardening shears left on a low stone wall, and a dog leaning his whole weight against a fence because it was the closest he could get to being held. She stood, brushed the gravel from her knees, and walked back toward the house before the sky could start turning gray. Inez waited until the house had gone fully dark, past midnight, past the hour when even Carol's light under the kitchen door finally went out. Then she dressed quietly, pulled the coat with the hidden pages from the back of her closet, and slipped out through the servant's entrance with a flashlight she'd bought from the drugstore weeks earlier and never used. She had 1 night left, maybe less. Titan was awake when she reached the kennel, standing at the gate before she'd even crossed the last stretch of lawn, as though he'd known she was coming before she knew it herself. She clipped the leash on with hands that weren't entirely steady and led him out through the gate, past the fountain, toward the rose garden, toward the one place in that entire property he had spent 4 years refusing to walk through willingly. Halfway there, she almost turned back. She thought about Roland's face when he'd torn the page from her notebook, about the job she needed, about the sister back home counting on money that wouldn't come if Inez lost this position over something she couldn't even prove yet. She thought about the way people in her life had a habit of disappearing the moment she asked too many questions, and how easily this could end the same way, with her packing a single bag before sunrise and no one at Calder House ever speaking her name again. But she thought too about the pen scratching across paper in that study, about first thing in the morning, and she kept walking. The estate at that hour looked nothing like the place she'd walked through 5 weeks earlier on her first afternoon. The hedges she'd once thought looked cut from a magazine now seemed to lean in around the path, black shapes with no edges in the dark, and the fountain's steady hum sounded less like elegance and more like something that had simply never learned how to stop. The stone steps sat pale under the flashlight beam, the climbing roses beside them dark shapes against the night, thorns catching faintly in the light like 100 small warnings. Titan stopped 10 feet away, exactly where he always stopped, body rigid, that same low sound building in his throat that wasn't quite a growl. This time, Inez didn't pull him forward and she didn't turn back. She crouched down beside him, one hand steady on his shoulder, feeling the tremor running through him under her palm, and let the beam of her flashlight travel slowly across the steps themselves, inch by inch, looking for anything that might explain 4 years of a dog refusing to cross 3 feet of stone. She found it on the 3rd step. A crack, long and jagged, running diagonally across the surface, deep enough to have collected years of dirt and moss inside it, old enough that no one walking past in daylight would think twice about it. The kind of imperfection a person's eye simply slides over on the way to somewhere else. She moved the light closer, kneeling now, tracing the shape of it with her eyes. 4 parallel gouges, close together, curved slightly, the marks unmistakable once she let herself see them for what they were instead of what they seemed like at first glance. Not a crack from settling stone or a hard winter, claw marks. Deep, desperate claw marks, dug into rock by something trying with everything it had to hold on to a surface it was being pulled away from. She looked at Titan, at his front paws, at the shape and spacing of his own claws where they rested against the gravel beside her. They matched. Her hands were shaking now, not from cold. She thought of him 4 years younger, still a young dog, straining at the end of a leash on the morning Margaret Calder was lost to that garden, throwing his whole weight backward, claws raking for purchase against rock that gave him nothing to hold on to. She thought of how long a dog might keep trying, even after it was already too late, and how a body remembers a failure like that in ways a mind never has to put into words. She pulled Doyle's notebook from inside her coat, flipping fast to the torn page near the back, holding the flashlight at a low angle across the strip of remaining paper the way she'd learned to read faded ink, letting the shadows fall into the pressed indentations left by whatever had been written on the missing page. In that angle of light, more of it came through than it had in her bedroom lamp. Not a full sentence, but enough, a month, a day, the last 2 digits of a year that matched, when she forced herself to remember it, the same year Carol had once mentioned, offhand, as the year everything at Calder House had changed, the same date as the accident. She sat back on her heels in the wet grass, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in her grip, and understood all at once what she'd been circling for weeks without letting herself land on it. Doyle had been in this garden the morning Margaret Calder died. He'd written down what he'd seen, or some part of it, on a page that no longer existed, and someone with enough reason to fear those words had made sure it never would again. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would stand up in any office or courtroom, a torn page and a crack in old stone. But it was the first thing in 5 weeks that fit together instead of contradicting itself, and Inez, kneeling in the wet grass with a shaking dog beside her, understood that fitting together was sometimes the only kind of proof a person got to start with. She thought, for one strange moment, of the trainer's report she'd found folded in the kennel shed weeks earlier, the words unpredictable and not recommended for rehabilitation typed out so confidently by someone who had clearly never once knelt down at 10 feet and simply watched. Every person who had walked past this dog for 4 years had seen exactly what they expected to see. She was the only one who had stopped long enough to see something else. She was still staring at the fragment, the pieces sliding into place with a clarity that made her stomach turn, when gravel crunched behind her. Inez. Roland stood at the top of the path, still in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, like he'd dressed in a hurry. His eyes went from her face to the flashlight, to the notebook in her hand, and whatever composure he usually wore had already started slipping. "You need to give me that," he said, closer now, his voice low and fast in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "This isn't about a cat scratch, is it?" Inez said, standing, the notebook clutched against her chest. "Give it to me." He lunged for it before she could answer, faster than she expected, and his hand closed around the edge of the leather cover. She held on, twisting away, and for a few seconds it became a real struggle, clumsy, both of them stumbling half a step down toward the crack in the stone, Roland's fingers digging into her wrist hard enough to bruise, his breath coming fast and ragged in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Titan moved between them before either of them fell. He didn't bite, he didn't need to. He simply planted himself square in front of Inez, chest low, a single sound tearing out of his chest that ended the argument outright, louder than anything she'd heard from him in 5 weeks of near silence, and Roland stumbled back a full step, releasing her wrist like it had burned him. For one long second, nobody moved. Roland stood frozen at the edge of the flashlight's glow, staring down at the dog he'd spent 4 years insisting was too dangerous to keep, a dog that had just placed itself between a grown man and the one person in that house who'd finally started asking the right questions. The sound of the scuffle, gravel scattering, Roland's sharp exhale, Titan's single warning bark echoing off the stone walls of the garden, carried farther than any of them realized in the stillness of that hour. A light came on in the house, second floor, a window Inez recognized as Warwick's. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the light behind him, looking down at the 3 shapes in his garden, the crouched maid, the cousin frozen halfway down the path, the dog standing rigid and protective between them. He couldn't have made out details from that distance, not yet, not the crack in the stone, or the notebook clutched in Inez's hand, or the fading scratch still visible on the back of Roland's wrist where his sleeve had ridden up during the struggle. But he was already moving toward the stairs, already reaching for the robe hung over the back of his chair, something in the shape of what he'd seen from that window, 3 figures locked in a moment that made no sense against a garden he hadn't walked through willingly in 4 years, had already told him, before he understood a single fact of it, that whatever was happening down there was something he could no longer afford to sleep through. Warwick crossed the garden faster than he'd moved in years, his robe half open, bare feet indifferent to the cold, sharp gravel biting at his soles the whole way, and reached the rose bed just as Titan's warning bark faded into the dark. "What is going on out here?" he said, and his voice carried the particular sharpness of a man who has been avoiding a fear for so long that finding it waiting for him at last feels almost like relief. "Nothing," Roland said quickly, stepping back, straightening his sleeve. "She was out here in the middle of the night, snooping through the garden with the dog. I came out to stop her." Warwick's eyes moved past him, to Inez, to the leather notebook still clutched to her chest, to Titan standing between them with his hackles still raised. Then, almost without meaning to, his gaze dropped to Roland's wrist, where the sleeve had ridden up again during the struggle and hadn't yet been pulled back down. He went still. "What is that?" Warwick said. Roland followed his cousin's gaze down to the scratch on the back of his hand, and for the first time since Inez had known him, something in his face slipped entirely, the practiced calm cracking straight through. "I told you, a cat, out by the stables." Warwick didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter than Inez had ever heard from him. His voice dropped until it was barely more than breath. Margaret's doctor documented a scratch on your hand the morning she died, he said. You told him the dog did it, trying to save her. I don't know what you're talking about. 4 parallel marks, Warwick went on, like he hadn't heard him, like the words had been sitting inside him for 4 years, waiting for exactly this moment to come out. Same hand, same spacing, healed over once and picked open again since. I saw the photograph in her file. I've seen it 100 times since, because I couldn't stop looking at it, trying to understand how a dog she loved could have done that to her that morning. He stepped closer to Roland, close enough that Inez could see his hands were shaking now too, though not from cold. Titan didn't scratch you saving her, Warwick said. He scratched you trying to stop you. Roland didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence, the way his eyes dropped to the crack in the stone step, the way his shoulders folded inward like something structural inside him had finally given way, said everything his voice refused to. I needed control of the trust before she changed it, he said finally, so low it barely carried. She was going to move everything to Warwick outright, cut me out entirely. I only meant to talk to her. I never meant for her to fall. Afterward, I went through Doyle's notebook in the shed. I tore out the page where he'd written what he saw. I didn't think anyone would ever ask to see the rest of it. Warwick's hands had curled into fists at his sides, knuckles white. 28 years, he said, almost to himself, like he was counting something only he could see. 28 years I've known you, and every one of them I thought the worst thing you'd ever done to me was borrow money you never paid back. He looked down at the crack in the 3rd step, really looked at it for the first time in 4 years, instead of walking wide around it the way everyone in that house had learned to do, and something in his face folded further, as though he was seeing, all at once, every version of that morning he had spent 4 years refusing to imagine in any detail at all. The garden went silent except for the fountain somewhere behind them, its steady, indifferent hum the only sound left in a night that had just torn itself open. Somewhere in the dark hedges a bird startled and resettled, the small ordinary sound of a world that had no idea what had just been said out loud beneath it. Warwick sank down onto the 2nd step, not the 3rd, his legs no longer able to hold the weight of what he'd just heard, and for a moment none of them moved. Roland standing frozen at the edge of the light, Inez still holding the notebook against her chest like a shield. Then Titan crossed the space between them, slow and careful, and lay down at Warwick's feet. Warwick looked down at him. Really looked, for what might have been the first time in 4 years, at the dog he'd blamed for something he'd never done, the dog who'd spent 4 years locked away and shaking at the sight of 3 feet of stone because it was the last place he'd seen the woman who raised him. He reached out, slowly, and rested his hand on Titan's head. Titan didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch the way he'd once leaned into Inez's leg on a quiet morning walk, and Warwick, cousin still standing a few feet away, with nowhere left to run, and a lie 4 years old, finally lying in pieces on the ground between them, put his other hand over his own face and, for the first time since his grandmother's funeral, wept. Inez stayed where she was, the notebook still pressed to her chest, watching a man who had spent 4 years punishing an innocent animal for his own unspoken grief, finally set that grief down in front of the only 2 witnesses who had never stopped believing the truth was still findable, if someone was only willing to kneel down and look for it. Roland left Calder House quietly before sunrise, escorted out by the family's attorney only after the county investigator had come, gone, and taken his statement. Everyone in the house understood by then that the courts, not the family, would settle what the study door had hidden for 4 years. By mid-morning that same day, the leash that had hung by the kennel gate since before Inez arrived was gone for good. Titan walked the rose garden freely that afternoon, past the 3rd step, over it, around it, however he chose, with no one left who needed to control where he went. Warwick knelt beside him at the base of those steps and stayed there a long time, one hand resting on the dog's back, saying nothing that needed saying out loud anymore. Inez stood at the edge of the garden, the leather notebook still tucked under her arm, watching a man and a dog find their way back to each other after 4 years neither of them had chosen. Warwick looked up at her once, and there was something steady in his face that hadn't been there the week she'd arrived. "Stay," he said, not as staff, as someone who actually saw him. Titan lifted his head at the sound of her name, and for the first time since she'd stepped through the gates of Calder House, nobody in that garden had anything left to hide.